Do you love stories, especially those that are dark, strange, and uncanny? Here is your renewed invitation to a place where safety is left far behind, where the bounds of reality expand out beyond the edge of what you have seen or heard, and everything you know might just slowly, stealthily unravel. Do you see that loose thread dangling from the tapestry there in front of you? Yes, that one. Along the border of the life you've so carefully woven. Go on, give it a gentle pull. Can you stop the incessant urge once it has taken hold? Should you even try? Now, as we sense that thread unravel just a little more, we cannot guess what previously hidden flaws will be exposed in the weave itself and make plain what has been concealed. Now be our guest for this night at our favorite cafe and listen in. For some part of your own story might just be revealed as the string is pulled. Broken Circle presents a story preeminent fiction podcast, Pull a String. Season 1, Unsettling Forecast. Episode 6, The Influencers. Now, as we have seen, our hero, Zohar, has made the Berserker Cafe his favorite haunt, and is, whether he acknowledges it, now a regular. Awaiting him is Tim Zohar, the weaver of strange stories, the tale of sinister verbal mastery. So sit back, dear friends, settle in, if you dare. Tonight's excursion into the unknown awaits, further unraveling the dazzling and beguiling cloth you have for so long adored and embraced. For the influencers have arrived, and are now crouching at your door, and who can resist heeding them? From Stories of the Berserker Cafe, entry number 6, Monday, September 5th, 2022. The tale of the previous Wednesday, in which Zohar had related his experiences at a strange West Virginia museum, had left me feeling both uplifted and unsettled. As I tried processing through its many implications, I found myself filled with an odd mixture of awe, dread, and euphoria. For the first time in a little while, I allowed myself to whimsically consider if such things were really possible. Still, I resisted giving in. I did not attempt any research into that museum. I am still not ready yet, and this was my real motive for not searching out the solid facts and details he did reveal. This time, upon entering the Berserker Cafe, I found Tim Zohar waiting for me. As I came up to him, we exchanged hellos. I had missed his usual chess match, but didn't wonder at the outcome. Everything around remained calm and tranquil in the cafe. I just anticipated that if he had lost, there would be a certain edginess in the atmosphere. Do I even need to ask how the chess game came out tonight? Tim arched his left eyebrow. You are assuming I won. Yes, I replied. Otherwise, this place would be a bit less calm. He chuckled in response. You are observant. He just left it hanging there with no further explanation. I smiled back. Don't worry, I won't press you on exactly what is going on. Really, you should teach a class on chess strategy, maybe even a YouTube channel. He shook his head. No thanks, he said, smiling. For me, it would be a landmine. The wrong sort of people might recognize me. You go online, right? I asked him. He looked at me, a slight smile appearing. Of course, but if you ever had a channel, what would you do? I thought for a moment. I don't know. I have a science podcast of some sort, I suppose. Go over current discoveries, debunk conspiracy theories, brag on creationists, stuff like that. Become an influencer for rationality, like Asimov, Sagan, Shermer, or Neil deGrasse Tyson, I answered. Tim didn't miss a beat, but asked, that phrase, an influencer. Have you thought about what it really means? It is used a great deal, but little understood. None of you know anything about what a real influencer is. I tilted my head, puzzled. What do you mean? Tim didn't answer me directly, but instead asked a different question. What happens if you ever find that rational approach severely shaken? I was equally quick and cocky. I don't know if it ever could be. Hasn't it been already? The eyes that met mine probed deeply. And what if you said something wrong at the wrong time? Tim asked. Or offended the wrong people with the right answer, triggered them. The real power there is limited even in the best of circumstances, and in the hands of the receiver rather than the sender. You must please and bow to an audience. I thought for a moment about his point. Although most everyone, I said, at least under a certain age, it seems, wants to be an influencer, don't they? Have the fame, the attention, the adulation. At least it seems so. Tim nodded, then laughed. Yes, be an influencer, as you said, but by no means get yourself straightened out first. And in what direction are you taking your so-called followers? Would you even know? Look at all those recent scandals that kept erupting. Or that one guy. He did all those animation and comic book reviews. All that drama with his purported girlfriends. He seemed amused at first, and then his expression grew intense, scarred by something. Perhaps he was remembering some dreadful case as yet unknown to me. I answered his question, and the sound of my voice got his attention. Ed odd? Yeah, it turned out he was a bit more odd than people could have conceived. Tim, it appeared, was pulling himself up out of his well of dark memory. Yes, he was beyond depraved. He sighed. Now consider this. What if an influencer was not beholden to the whims of his audience, could bypass their defenses, and tunnel deep enough? He or she could potentially subvert their will. I shook my head. They'd have a dreadful power, and who would stop them? He glanced around, making sure no one was listening. You'd first need to recognize what was going on, if you could. He took a sip from his cup. Then isolate their voice from yours. If you want to hear this, then you may have to steel yourself. You can't be, what is the terminology these days? Easily triggered by matters regarding suicide and severe manipulation. I tilted my head. I think I've proven that I am not that squeamish or Victorian. Tim raised his eyebrow, as if momentarily in doubt. Good. It appears we have our tale, he stated. Once I'd gotten my venti chai, pulled out the recorders, settled in, Tim Zohar, after taking a sip from his Cafe Americano, said, Now this began as a series of seemingly random incidents we did not see the significance of at first. Looking back, we were a little too slow in recognizing the troubling pattern. Once we did, there was panic among certain people in my company. Understand, incidents such as the ones I will describe do not spring up out of nowhere, but most often have deep and sprawling roots in the past. I was soon drawn in for my study of those previous iterations. Once the others had been briefed, I insisted that there was no time we could spare before this contagion spread and many would die. As I unveil this case, I'm not just being excessively secretive, only giving a broader overview of the facts. At this point, I can only begin at the end and work a little way into the past. It is far too long a tale for one evening. Perhaps someday you can learn the full story. But this must suffice for now. Many innocent people, some known and some unknown, have suffered, Jonah, from the clinical use of the acidic skill I am unfolding before you. Its gradual refinement, reaching a level of competency never achieved before by former experimenters. The origins of this technique was not without its own dangers and possessed some severe flaws. Do not imagine that they were innocent of the same corrosive intentions as the others, despite their assumed loyalty to one another. Yet this did not keep them from being betrayed by an even more ambitious individual, who had rather more sinister plans. Whereas they had sought control over the masses, he would begin with the heart of a person and move up the scale from there. I suppose that is at the heart of what happened next. This newly founded rogue element began with an even more well-funded institution, conducting all the severe experiments that would follow. Even the reality-bending event of 1999 did not filter out in the newly settled order of things the power they had already gained. You might say it inheres within the existent, and is a consequence of articulate speech, malevolently abused into the deadliest possible contours it was never born for. A tapestry of lies, patterned into highly persuasive forms, challenging the very will of the soul itself. So there were some initial incidents, each different from the others, yet related in a way that was unclear. What were the causes that correlated to these different outcomes? Something clearly para or metanormal was involved. They were effective, yet had just appeared abruptly, yet seemingly without precedent. There was a change in behavior that brought about tragic results within minutes, a few hours, or at most 2 or 3 days. I will share 3 of these now, and then one more before we part that turned out differently. But you must hear the others first, then reasons we discovered it had all come about. Then, and only then, you'll be ready for a final disturbing revelation as to why and how it was all done. As for the first, we learned about it when we finally cornered a few witnesses. This was the one out of the seemingly disparate incidents that gave us a critical clue as to what was happening. Picture a bus stop in a large city. A group of people are waiting under a shelter, with its steel frame, glass, and a few seats. The ones with those bars dividing up the benches, so no one can sleep there. And 3 or 4 people waiting eagerly, or so it seems, for the arrival of their bus. One of these was a mother of 3. Let us call her Annie. She was by all accounts a very well-adjusted person, in love with her husband, and dedicated to seeing her kids raised so that they would have a better life. As always, these are somewhat surface features, and the real picture is far more complex. Quite unexpectedly, a stranger sat down beside the woman, whispered some words, no more than 2 or 3 short sentences. The woman froze, remaining quiet for several moments. A stricken, hopeless expression gradually filled her face. Her eyes widened as if in shock. One witness did notice she never blinked for the remaining time she sat there. Then she slowly, incrementally, got up. The whispering figure now was hanging back behind the bus shelter. This witness could not see beneath the gray hoodie, save a few strands of light-colored hair. The bulky clothes hid any clue as to his or her identity. Now the road in front of the bus stop was very busy that night. Cars, other buses, trucks, even motorcycles hurled past. At a moment's notice, the woman raised her arm as if brushing something away. In the same manner, a second witness said, "You'd brush away cobwebs, or a curtain." She then unhurriedly, almost casually, stepped out into traffic, managed to get as far as the second of the 3 lanes, and was struck by a dark gray SUV, whose driver swore that 2 seconds before the woman had been invisible. She wore a navy blue trench coat, a black silk scarf, and had dark brown hair. He also stated that at the moment just before impact, her blank expression disappeared, as if she had come back from being very far away. The next moment, she was hurled into the back of a red PT Cruiser, shattering the trunk window and bending the lower metallic half. Her neck snapped and back broken. Inside both vehicles were families, just heading home for the evening. So, 3 extended families were forever traumatized and altered by this one act. As for the person who had spoken to her, another witness had sworn it was a slim girl, possibly in her late 20s to early 30s. No trace could be uncovered. One man thought he saw her moving away down the street just before the impact, but nothing definite was found out by the police. Since no one had overheard what had been exchanged between the 2, witnesses were uncertain if only the woman in the hoodie had spoken or the victim had said anything in response, so establishing any kind of culpability on the part of the slim girl was impossible. And oh yes, in case you had any doubts, Annie was a victim, murdered just as if someone had shoved her into the oncoming traffic. None of the witnesses could have known this, and the perpetrator had slunk off into the metropolitan night. Now the next case occurred about 6 days later, across town in a nearby mall, Cross Paths, which was nearly empty, but oddly had 2 main attractions, a busy food court and a movie theater. Just why this condition existed no one understood at the time, but this will also become apparent later on. In this instance, a relatively well-built, but not overly developed muscular businessman was having a salad for lunch. Call him Ahab. Someone holding a tray with a hamburger and extra-large fries sat down at a small table behind him. A moment later, this young man dropped the bag he was carrying. The businessman, Ahab, noticed and turned. Perhaps he thought he should see if everything was all right. A momentary conversation passed between them, no more than a few sentences. Nothing immediately changed. Ahab turned back and went on eating the salad. But this time there was a difference. Whereas he had been eating slowly, he now ate rapidly, finishing it in a few minutes. The very tall and skinny young man behind him had by this time stuffed his remaining food into a white paper bag and silently left, glancing back just once. The businessman gulped down the bottle of water he had chosen, paused, and stared at it, and then looked up. Several people who knew him were surprised at all this, by this change. He had always paced himself when he ate, finishing his salad and then casually visiting with the few acquaintances he had acquired during the years he had come there once or twice a week. Several now noticed a slight but alarming change in his usual behavior. Ahab had begun staring intensely at each food counter and kiosk in succession. As he stood up, he licked his lips in a very sensuous manner. The first station in the semicircle-shaped food court, a Sbarro's pizza, was what he had targeted. He strolled over and ordered several slices of pepperoni, sausage, bacon, and mushroom. After getting them, Ahab turned rapidly back to the table and furtively glanced around. Then opening the triangular containers, devoured each slice quickly. When he had jammed the last bite in, he looked up once more. This time he ordered a full pizza at the Sbarro's with every topping available. In short order he was done and shoved the large pizza box away. Once more there was that furtive glance around. The next restaurant was a Slappy's Sub. The food he'd already devoured hadn't been enough. He ordered a cheesesteak, a cold roast beef, a chicken teriyaki, and onion footlongs. Humming now to himself, he spread them out on a larger table nearby. Additionally, Ahab had ordered the largest soda pop he could get, a cherry Coke, the Slappy's clerk remembered. At the table, he tore each bag open, ripping large chunks from the subs, chewing each with a frightening rhythmic speed. This is probably being generous, but within 10 minutes he had devoured them all. As this phase of his personal mukbang ended, he let out a satisfied, loud belch. After this, he found his third option, China Hub, and got up, leaving the torn bags, wrapping, and boxes piled up on the table. When he returned, it was with huge portions of chicken teriyaki, orange chicken, Mongolian beef, sweet and sour chicken, and 3 large portions of pork fried rice, and a gallon of both sweet and sour sauce and egg drop soup. After a moment he shoved the refuse off, where it spilled out onto both an adjacent table and the floor. He paid it no mind, but instead rapidly opened each white and red container, pouring sweet and sour sauce indiscriminately on everything. With 2 plastic forks in hand, Ahab alternated between his selections, smacking his lips throughout, trilling his satisfaction at this carnage. Nor did he stop after that point. As each meal ended, its remnants were discarded willy-nilly. The trail left behind was not pretty. This went on for 2 more hours. Next, Ahab can be traced to a gourmet donut shop near the food court, hailing a dozen donuts, all the time humming and sighing in immense satisfaction. Outside, he let out both an enormous burp and a generous explosion of hindside gas, producing a hovering smell akin to rotting fish, diesel fumes, and a particularly sour methane. A wicked and indulgent grin overcame his face and highlighted the 2 rows of teeth crammed with fragments of his feasts. Within that moment he shuddered, began wandering forward, stopped, shook his head. Onward he went, an almost willing icon of a man who had deprived himself for years, suddenly finding liberation, which ended in a dark gluttony that displaced everything else. Whether or not this was a result of the mimetic sorcery he had been pierced by, he continued forcing large quantities down his gullet. The trail the businessman left behind continued in a long string throughout that evening, ending in a grocery store in the early morning hours. All the while, his overall appearance changed, his clothes straining and stretching in peculiar ways. Long before the long-born grocery opened, Ahab had forced his way in, eaten a variety of bread, cakes, and cold meats, and drank down 4 large bottles of Coke, Dr. Pepper, and ginger ale. This last seems to have been an attempt to rid himself of excess gas, but it failed. The once well-proportioned body was now a bloated mass. He died with a quarter of a cold hoagie stuffed into his mouth, and the rest clenched in his fist. The paramedics, when they arrived, were unable to remove it. A bit of further inquiry was conducted, but neither the police nor the health department, much less his family, were able to uncover any more. Even his ex-wife, who had found fault in him for many things, was adamant that this behavior was inexplicable. The only further evidence they found was a hastily scrawled note in his suit jacket pocket. Deprivation of certain pleasures is the worst possible sin. This is the new revelation. Eat, drink, and be ecstatic at the wondrous, delicious taste. Taste. Ah, never going without. Never again. The slip of paper was covered with marinara sauce, cheese, mustard, and egg yellow. The coroner's report determined that the direct cause of death was a heart attack. There were also signs of sporadic oxygen deprivation, of course. This case was even more unusual than the first. The average reader might think it was the story of an addict going on his last fatal bender. This incident was the one that began causing some concern, although in many ways it was the opposite of the first. But a pattern was emerging. The nature of those instances suggested intentionality, perhaps even nuanced experiments whose goal was the assessment of certain outcomes. Just how these individuals were being compelled so completely by compatriots were as yet uncertain, although the terrifying possibilities of pure verbal manipulation were not far from their minds. We all hoped it could not be true. We were wrong. Our final example occurred one afternoon at an art gallery in the downtown area of the same city. Before they closed that day, the gallery owner had made his final walkthrough. We will call him Jean Paul. Now the store appeared empty. When at about 5 minutes until close, the door chime was triggered, a young man wearing a brown wool coat and tan and dark green scarf entered. The smooth, almost weightless, slithering movements and his furtive demeanor made the salesperson, Rebecca, let us call her, a trifle nauseous. The young man asked to speak to the owner, since a particularly attractive piece by Andrew Jacoby in the window had gotten his attention. Rebecca, who knew this was a particularly lucrative, rare painting, quickly went to fetch the owner. Jean Paul was all smiles and eagerness. For just a few moments they went off together, but not before Jean Paul asked Rebecca to get their potential customer some tea. She had been gone only 5 minutes when she returned with a cup of hot tea, made to the young man's quickly conveyed specifications, only to find him gone and the owner standing there slightly bowed over, shuddering, with a twisted grin on his face. He mumbled something about hollow beauties, all trivial deception, and a wheeling, burning mind, urging the loss and purification of everything. Before she could realize what was happening, Jean Paul went over by another very valuable painting and began slashing it from the left corner to the right and then the opposite way. Rebecca froze, her queasiness and vertigo intensifying, uncertain of what she should do. When she tried stopping him, he slashed at her with the Swiss Army knife he always carried, leaving a gash on her arm. When she ran for the phone, Rebecca found that he'd severed the handset cord and ripped out the jack going into the wall. Without any alternative, she ran outside for help, but not before grabbing the Andrew Jacoby in the window. Fortunately, next door was a small local pharmacy, and she phoned the police. Now by the time they arrived, smoke was billowing out of the door and the window was smashed. Jean Paul had gone berserk, tearing the store apart, screaming as he frantically searched for the missing painting. By the time the ambulance arrived and attended poor Rebecca, he'd finally been restrained by the police. The final assessment showed Jean Paul had done over $100,000 in damage at his own gallery, breaking sculptures, one from the classical era, no less, and had begun burning paintings he'd already slashed or cut up. Jean Paul just screamed that everything in the gallery was now just empty. He had a view of the shadows behind everything. Couldn't they see? It was all just horribly colored goop placed in funny geometric forms on cheap canvas, whose shades and patterns signified nothing. No one remarked too deeply on this, and the newspaper article escaped serious notice at first. People do go mad all the time. Yet when finally compared alongside other incidents in the same city, all not far from the same location, they gradually pointed us toward the Gygas Institute. After the collapse of the Star Language Project at a certain Midwestern university, which had been halted after a series of malevolent incidents, it had shattered into numerous factions and cliques. Another story for another day. Gygas was but one surviving coterie, but their newer projects were supposedly harmless and above board, consisting only of obsessive theorizing on the nature of speech. It had presumably abandoned the more noxious aspects of its earlier partners for more benign pursuits, had in fact kept itself to itself, but this was merely a cover for their real activities. In fact, the remnants from the Star Language Project had emerged from the underground into a number of competing and evolving designs, some of them having the same appearance as Gygas, that of a think tank. Yet their common and ultimate goals remain broadly loyal to the original vision. This will become evident before the end. My corporation had missed this now clear point. We thought the survivors had learned from the follies of the older project, but this was simply not true. A thorough investigation was launched, and it was discovered that Gygas was an extensive property holder in the area, an investor in the bus service company, and nearly sole owner of the Cross Paths Mall, as well as several other businesses. We suspected these had been obtained as staging areas, places where experiments could be conducted in the open, but with little or no outside interference. A string of further incidents occurred, and we decided it was appropriate that they know that their activities had been uncovered, and a strong message was sent directly. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before I end this, there was one further series of incidents occurring in an exercise and health club, nearly an hour from the city center, in a suburb not far from the countryside. As you can guess, it was partially owned by a Gygas front company. Adjacent to a golf course, it was used by middle-aged golfers, hungry wives, and sophisticated bodybuilders who valued the facilities and available perks. Naturally, all of the facilities and equipment were first-rate, so why wouldn't they come in fair numbers? Now, the person who showed up this time was a blonde, blue-eyed beauty, the kind who usually end up in the pictures, as the saying goes. Eventually, we learned that this physical appearance was an easy blind in a more nefarious purpose. Over the course of about an hour, using this attractive demeanor, she engaged in friendly conversation with 3 males and 2 females. With each of the men she appeared flirtatious, even interested, and with the women just engaged in small talk. In each case, uttering those 3 potent sentences which had been personally designed for each individual, all part of a program spawned by a demonic urge for manipulative power. Neither one of us would ever really understand such motives. You can guess what mainly happened after. But surprisingly, there was one who did resist and also helped another. If you only looked at the surface, this man was not one who would have the mental fortitude needed for such endurance, but only if you judge by outward appearance. Let us call his name Jake, a man whose hobby had long been bodybuilding. He spoke slowly with a slight Tennessee accent and seemed often halting, or at least hesitant in his responses, a characteristic many people judged as a sign he was slow. Few could have realized that these responses were reflective and considered, for Jake's real passion was poetry. Concerning this latter devotion he had told only a few people. During his daily life, his mind raced sometimes at a frightening pace, absorbing much that went on around him. It was the discipline of the bench press that helped quell this and allowed him the space afterward to focus more thoroughly on one thing. Although Jake knew he would never approach the perfection of a Charles Atlas or a Schwarzenegger, he still liked the physique he had developed over the years. Sometimes he also took pride in the fact that he was one of the few people in the modern world who had really studied Milton, Keats, and Shelley from a poet's perspective. But the neglect and almost total loss of the older art forms by modern poets left Jake despairing and wondering if a revival were even possible. With such thoughts often intruding, he wished he could have been born at least a century or 2 earlier. Then a man like Shelley, Keats, or Lord Byron could have been a poet, and no one would have dared question his masculinity. Years before, when he was much younger, other men he'd admired had laughed at him when he had dared reveal his secret ambition. The same thing had happened with 2 or 3 girlfriends. After he'd felt close enough to them, he'd shared a poem or 2, or when another had come across one of his many notebooks and called him an effeminate fool. This left him cumulatively with a number of doubts concerning his own value. One day he just realized there was no space he could breathe in this modern world, but nevertheless he was condemned to it as it was. So he'd grown silent regarding it, telling no one, working only in secret. Jake had then grown even less communicative, less social, even avoiding others. Yet he remained a thinker, well versed in religion and philosophy. As had become their usual practice, Gygas had microscaled the memplex, just 3 short sentences for the individual, then probing and studying them behind their lives until they knew them well, waiting for the maximum moment of vulnerability. Someday they had hoped to do this on a macro scale, an ambition that was discovered, of course, later on and nearly too late. Perhaps it was these two seemingly contradictory sides, and as we learned later, a certain suspicion that had been growing in his mind that allowed him the level of resistance he exhibited. Jake was engaged in conversation with a woman who called herself Tiffany when she'd uttered those 3 sentences crafted for him alone, successive expressions embodying despair, bewilderment, and stupefaction crossed his face. Then a smirk that made Tiffany pull back. Jake looked at her and at first said only one word, "No." Here the grip of the meme fell away, slipping into nothingness. Tiffany peered at him astonished. This had not happened before, and, well, how else can I put it? Certain energies were uncoupled that it was not healthy that she remain near. Jake grabbed her arm, staring into her eyes, and said, "Is this what you do, like crouching at the door of some innocent mind ready to pounce with a desire to consume another's life?" She pulled away, turned, and without going back into the locker room left. This ended up being the last time anyone heard from Gygas. Not a moment had passed when Jake heard someone crying out. The woman whom we shall call Inez, a single young lady, late 20s, had immigrated to the United States from Spain after studying in Boston for several years. She was in the health club maintaining a well-cared-for body. Once in a great while she would indulge herself, or so her then boyfriend, OJ, stated. But nothing excessive, for she would feel a measure of guilt at times for her own good fortune when she saw those commercials with the hungry children. Why should she have so much? Why had she been put in the position that she'd never gone hungry? Now, after speaking with Tiffany, she was huddled in a corner, gashes on her own cheek, mumbling about horrible plans. "I'm too much, she screamed. "I take up too much space." Inez looked down at her own body. "I can shave some of this away, I'm sure. A little here, a little there. Who would miss it? Who needs 2 arms, or an extra ear? Who does? Less of me, less to feed." A twisted grin came over her face. What had she begun planning? We will never know. Jake reached down, took her by the arms, and shook Inez. Her eyes darted over at his face, a blank stare. Jake told us later on, when we debriefed him, that he had never been so focused in his life. "No," he said. "Tell them no. They've lied. Like a serpent of old, they lied. You are not too much. You fill up just as much space as you need." Inez blinked at this point. It took another 20 minutes before she came down out of the fugue state they'd placed her in. Just at that moment, the moment she believed Jake, those dangerous energies began dispersing back toward those they'd come from originally. For some at Gygas, it was not a pleasant night. This is ever the danger of sorcery. Still, they had ignored our warm and fuzzy warning from the week before. So that is all I can or will say for now. Zohar leaned back, relaxed in the wooden chair. We just studied each other for several seconds. I could not help but think this was a kind of chess game as well, with rules of a different sort, where the stakes were much higher. It had taken us some time to track what Gygas was really doing. At first it appeared that these were random targets. Given what emerged from our analysis, it became clear that when it came to certain related and entangled guilt issues, each selected individual had vulnerable personality traits. We could only conclude that the targeting was very deliberate and malicious. Gygas had engineered destruction for these innocents, and now we knew it. Before he could speak again, I put up my hand. I had never been that bold, and almost shocked myself. A pleased smile came over his face. When I remained silent, unsure about what I'd just done, he said, "Well?" But what, I asked, happened to the Gygas Institute? Surely you just didn't let them continue on with impunity. Please tell me your organization, intervened further. Zohar's expression was whimsical, gratified. I can't say much on that score for obvious reasons. Someday you will learn about the subsequent history of certain members. Yet I can say this. If you look for them, you will not find them, though you searched high and low, near or far. I sat back with a new respect for who I'd been dealing with. Did this mean that Gygas had been scrubbed from the historical record, its secrets secured and destroyed so that no one could ever unravel such sinister techniques again? As usual, I did not get those answers. If the heart of this mystery would ever be known, patience, one of the many lost virtues, was one I'd continue acquiring more and more. I thanked Tim once again. He nodded before rising. I sat there staring down at the recorders I'd brought. I felt slightly disoriented myself, but shaking my head, packed my briefcase. For tonight, anyway, it was over. In a little while, I would see Tim yet again for another story. So now, once again, an unsettling narrative had been presented for my amusement, or edification, or enlightenment, whatever the case might be. Parable or history, it has not left me unmoved. As before, I wondered where Tim's story would leave me, not knowing this time it would be in a dim room where the fear of soft voices and insidious messages lingers like a light fading perfume. As I transcribed this, I will admit my hands trembled slightly. For a moment I had feared he would tell me one of those fateful memes, but I should have known better. Yet here is one more piece of a puzzle with few two pieces. For now, I can have little or no idea of how they might fit together. Some are surely dangerous, some are full of light, all have disturbed me in one way or another. Yet who can guess what strange hopes or assurances the next story might provide? I sense that these are not random tales, but have some wider range of purpose, greater than I can yet imagine. So, dear friends, yet another portion of the thread has been exposed, opening up some darker possibilities. Do not be discouraged by this display of a few more somber notes, for here in this great cloth, darker shades abide alongside brighter ones, as you will soon learn. Yet the displaced strands before you, cold or pleasant, somber or joyous, so many hidden patterns, must be made manifest. Yet I will continue here alongside you, a voice in the dark, a faithful companion through this midnight realm. Didn't I promise? For all this has just been a little more unraveling of a woven strand that was once secure in its place. But to what end? Have you not considered this yet? If you pull a string, you never know just how far the unraveling of it will lead you or into what circumstances. Yet I only now simply repeat my somber warning. Even so, faithful listeners, let us hope you will stay on and see this to its last destination. This has been a Story Preeminent Fiction podcast, presented by Broken Circle, Pull a String, created, conducted, and narrated by Stephen L. Dailey, photographed by Stephanie Dailey, music courtesy of Scott Buckley. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Next episode, And the Stars Bowed Down.